The Falcons made big investments in their defense, and will it move the needle for them in 2025?
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back, everyone, to another illustrious episode of the Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of Locked On Sports Atlanta, your team every day. And today's episode is brought to you by LinkedIn Jobs, going to help you find the qualified candidates that you want to talk to faster. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/LockedOnNFL. Terms and conditions apply. So if you do not know me, I'm your very humble host, Aaron Freeman, aka the Jolly Green Giant, aka the iron that sharpens the iron, aka Mr. AKA, and I've been covering the Atlanta Falcons for almost 2 decades. And I've been covering the NFL draft for over 2 decades. This is the 26th draft I've covered. So, I appreciate each and every one of you that, comes along for this illustrious coverage as everydayers. That means you make this podcast your first listen each and every day. And all you got to do to become an everydayer is subscribe or follow for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. So we'll talk about some and dissect some noteworthy comments from Jeff Ulbrich on Saturday about this draft and defense. We'll talk about the day 3 selections of Billy Bowman and Jack Nelson. But let's put a button on this draft now that the 2025 draft has ended. The Falcons entered the draft with 5 picks. They exited the draft with 5 picks, landing 4 defensive players. The day 3 selections began with Oklahoma DB Billy Bowman Jr., who is a safety that is expected to play nickel cornerback for the Falcons. That was their round 4 selection. We'll talk more about him later. And then they finished out with their lone offensive player. That was Wisconsin offensive tackle Jack Nelson in round 7. And of course, we'll also talk about him later. So their 5-man draft class, in case you were, out of the country or asleep or, just couldn't bear to think about what Terry Fontenot was cooking up. They get 2 edge rushers in round 1, Jalon Walker of Georgia and James Pearce Jr. of Tennessee. They get a safety and Xavier Watts of Notre Dame in round 3. Of course, Bowman and Nelson in rounds 4 and 7. And so when we look at the pros of this draft class, you get some high quality players at some particularly good value, particularly when you look at consensus boards like that of Arif Hassan. 4 of their top 4 picks were all top 100 players in the Arif Hassan consensus draft board. Jalon Walker, who they picked 15th, he was 11th on the consensus board. James Pearce, 26 on the consensus board. They picked him 26, right? Xavier Watts, they got him at pick 96. He was 48th on the consensus board. And Jeff Ulbrich basically intimated, and the team actually intimated after they selected him, that they were thinking he was going to be their potential pick in round 2. Obviously, they traded away to go get James Pearce. So they really like that value there. Billy Bowman was 96 on the consensus board. They got him at pick 118. And then Jack Nelson was 193 on the consensus board, and they got him at 218. And so the Falcons were aggressive at addressing their number 1 need for this football team, which was the pass rush, the thing that we talked about all off season long when we sat here and said, hey, we know for a fact, guys, with 100% certainty that the Atlanta Falcons are taking an edge rusher in round 1. And they, in fact, double dipped, right? All the hand wringing, all the nervousness, all the skepticism and questioning. Oh, are they going to take a tackle, or are they going to go in another direction? They're going to take a safety or a linebacker? No. At the end of the day, the Falcons did the thing that we knew they were going to do. This is why they called me the Falcons prophet. I told you guys this back in January. We knew with 100% certainty, no doubt about it. All that other stuff was just, playing up the character. But, never once did I ever doubt. Never once. So, they were able to double dip with that trade up. And that kind of gets to some of the concerns with the draft class, the cons of the draft, some areas of need that weren't necessarily addressed because of the limited number of picks, outside corner, nose tackle, 2 spots where we were hoping that maybe they could get some instant impact starters. They did need a corner. They didn't necessarily need to get that outside corner because of the presence of Mike Hughes. So they went with the nickel. And so at least they shored up that position. So we won't lose too much sleep, but there are going to be some wide receiver matchups later this fall and winter that we're going to sit here and be like, yeah, we probably could have used an outside corner when we face that particular team. But that's a problem that we'll have to deal with next year, which is the other con of the draft with the aggressiveness of the trading up, right? And it's funny because when I went to bed on Friday night, I was like thinking like, man, the draft analytics people for the Atlanta Falcons must hate Terry Fontenot. And then I listened to Terry Fontenot's presser from Friday night after the Watts pick on Saturday morning. And he basically jokingly admitted that the analytics guys sat him down and said, hey, Terry, you got to trade back this year. And Terry was like, nah, I ain't doing that. Let me cook. Right. And basically he said, when you have, to paraphrase, when you have conviction about the player, if you get a really good player, it makes it all worth it. And that's ultimately where my skepticism and criticism of this draft comes from, because they have this conviction when it comes to players, and they haven't really gotten those really good players that have made it all worth it. Right. And I explained this to the Locked On Falcons insiders this morning, that basically when you're trading up, you're giving up a draft pick to move up to get another draft pick. You're basically swapping two contributors. And if you're getting a difference maker, that makes it worth it. One difference maker equals two contributors. And that's what Terry Fontenot is talking about when he says it's worth it. But the problems with the Falcons' historic trade ups up to this point, right? We'll see how they all play out over the long term. But with Arnold Ebiketie, Matthew Bergeron, Ruka Roro up to this point, they haven't been getting those difference makers with these picks so far. They've been swapping out two contributors for just another contributor, and that basically the math isn't mathing on that regard. But we say kudos to Terry Fontenot. He's sticking to his guns. If he's going to go down, he's going to go down swinging. And so when we talk about, the criticism surrounding the trading of the first round pick, my philosophy is like, we have 5 decades of history telling us that trading future first round picks rarely works out. Trading, up in the draft doesn't necessarily work out. So, you're really swimming, upstream and whatnot, when you do that stuff. But, as we often say with pretty much anything involved in the NFL, all that anybody cares about is winning football games. And as long as the Falcons win football games, no one cares, right? It doesn't matter how you manage the salary cap. If you're winning football games, nobody cares, right? Everybody criticizes the Saints for their cap mismanagement, but the Eagles do all the exact same things, but they win football games and nobody cares, right? So, if the Falcons are picking in the playoffs next year with that first round pick, we're not going to miss it, right? If we're picking in the 20s, we'll miss it, but like, it's not going to be, no one's going to lose sleep over it, right? But if they're, they lose out on the top 10, top 15, top 12 pick or something like that, then we're going to have, some concerns. We're going to have some, Terry's going to have some explaining to do, but, maybe Terry's not around to do that explaining. So it does put extra scrutiny on James Pearce, who already kind of is a boom bust prospect, right? And so in a lot of ways, Terry Fontenot's legacy may be determined by what happens with James Pearce, as well as what happens with Michael Penix, right? Those are kind of the two legacy and defining picks for him that were sort of the quote unquote unorthodox picks for him. But, I think it's a good thing that the Falcons did get Jalon Walker in this draft class, who's a much safer player, a much safer bet for this football team. He is the headliner of this draft class. And so that does take a little bit of pressure off of James Pearce to have to kind of carry the load, that if Jalon Walker can be a difference maker, then people will be more forgiving of things if James Pearce doesn't quite live up to the hype. So we'll see on that front. But overall, I think the Falcons did a good job laying the foundation for what could be a good defense for years to come. That was kind of the goal that we went into this draft and wanted to come out of this draft. And so I think they were able to execute that in a pretty effective way. Obviously, time will tell on whether that plays out. We wondered sort of how much they were going to move the needle, at least in the immediate future, right? That goes back to the IID. Our friend Jarvis Davis of Locked On Sports Atlanta, it stands for the immediate impact defender, right? How many of those guys did they get? And ultimately, for me, that will be determined once I go through the film over the next couple of weeks and months and whatnot, and ultimately where I fall on that. And as we do those in-depth breakdowns on the podcast in the coming weeks, I'll basically tell you, yes, this guy checks the box of being that IID and all that sort of stuff. But, the reason why I don't quite get as hyped about the draft as others people do is because I know at the core of this, the draft is you're making bets today that really probably won't pay off till like 3 or more years from now. Right. And ultimately, is this going to pay off for the Falcons in 2025? And I thought it was interesting, and Jeff Ulbrich kind of intimated this in the video that the team produced on the heels of the first night of the draft, that, their goals are, they think this offense is going to score a lot of points, and that's going to rest highly on, our favorite quarterback that we love to pump, and we're going to pump all summer long, right? As well as hasn't always been our favorite offensive coordinator, but he's becoming our best friend, Zach Robinson, and Zach we trust, right? Hashtag in Zach we trust, right? And him showing exponential growth in year 2 of this offense. And then, you couple that with the defense and primarily their ability to generate pressure with some of the quarterbacks that they're going to face this year. If they're going to want to play at a playoff caliber level, they have to be able to generate pressure on some of these quarterbacks to keep a lid on some of these offenses that have the potential. Looking at you, the Rams, looking at you, the Bills, among others that can score a lot of points, that even if our offense is performing at a high level, similar to what we saw in week 18, why did we lose the week 18 game in Carolina? Because Bryce Young could just sit back and pick apart this defense. And, whether we're talking about Josh Allen or Bryce Young or JJ McCarthy, if you can't get pressure on the quarterback, not all, most of the quarterbacks at the NFL level will be able to pick apart your defense. And so with Walker, with Pearce, right, alongside, the three guys that are essentially rookies, second-year players, and Rook and Dorless and Trice that didn't play a ton last year, they're going to need all those guys to grow up fast, as well as Bowman and Watts and some of the other young pieces in the secondary. So it's basically the 2023 Rams formula. You couple a high-powered offense with a young defense. That Rams defense made the playoffs. That Rams team made the playoffs. They were 7th in DVOA on offense. They were 23rd in DVOA on defense. That's a winning formula for the Atlanta Falcons, I think, this year in the NFC South. But the issue for the Falcons is Aaron Donald's not coming through that door. And Aaron Donald was the guy that you knew was going to be able to get pressure on the quarterback. If he was on the football field, he was going to get to the quarterback. And so that made it a whole lot easier on everybody else's job. We'll circle back to that later in today's episode when we talk about what Jeff Ulbrich said on Saturday, because he was talking about scheming pressure because there is no Aaron Donald on this football team. But that will be a topic of discussion that I'm sure we will get into later today, as well as throughout the rest of the summer. But it's really, the coaches are really betting on themselves in a major way, and we'll see if that bet pays off for them in 2025. But let's talk about the bets that the Falcons made on day 3 in Billy Bowman and Jack Nelson as we continue today's Locked On Falcons. So as a small business owner, your work doesn't end when the clock hits 5. Your business is always on your mind, which means when it's time to hire, you need a partner that works just as hard as you do. That's where LinkedIn Jobs comes in. When you clock out, LinkedIn clocks in. LinkedIn is going to make it easy to post your job for free and share it with your network and get qualified candidates all in the same place. And when you post your job, LinkedIn has a new feature that can help you write job descriptions and then quickly get your job in front of the right people with deep candidate insights. And here's the pro tip: add the hashtag hiring frame to your profile picture and double your reach to qualified candidates. No wonder 72% of small businesses say LinkedIn Jobs has helped them find high quality hires. So post your job for free at linkedin.com/LockedOnNFL. That's linkedin.com/LockedOnNFL to post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply. So the Falcons drafted Billy Bowman, the Oklahoma safety, in round 4. He's 5'10", 192 pounds, has some slot experience, about a third of his career snaps, according to PFF, where he lined up in the slot at Oklahoma. He was at the Senior Bowl. As you guys well know, I was at the Senior Bowl. I wasn't really watching anybody other than the trench guys because, again, we knew then that perhaps one of these guys would be a future Falcon. Now, that didn't necessarily prove to be the case. But, when I wasn't watching Billy Bowman, I heard some good things about him in coverage, right? I did see some clips of him from the Senior Bowl in the one-on-ones. A lot of those reps came against the tight end where he looked really good. A couple of those, he went against wide receivers and he more than held his own. So that's going to be the challenge for him as he transitions to that nickel cornerback spot, covering the Chris Godwins of the world, the, Khalil Shakirs and all those sorts of guys. But, the best way I would describe his play is like he's a human missile. He's got that 4.42 speed. He's basically Clark Phillips, or the player that a lot of people wish Clark Phillips would be. Sorry, Clark, you got to catch these strays. But, that sort of smaller frame, T-Rex arms guys, great instincts in zone. But unlike Clark, Billy Bowman has speed to burn. He's willing to stick his face in the fan when it comes to run support. And so based off of my initial dipping my toe in the film, I would expect him to be the front runner, to be the nickel corner over Clark Phillips and D. Alford this year. But, you can never trust things with this regime where basically less than 20% of their draft picks so far have been week 1 starters for this team. But we're hoping that changes this year with this draft class. So what I've seen, I do think Bowman can play safety in the NFL. I think that's a nice fallback position for him. Now we're a month away from doing my deep dive on the film and doing the floor level, eye level and ceiling comps for him. But it seems like we might get there. We'll see. But I wouldn't be shocked if my ceiling comp for him might be Budda Baker, right? Those were kind of the vibes I was getting when I watched the one game that I've watched so far of him. So let's talk about Nelson. Haven't really watched any of him outside of a couple of clips I've seen on Twitter or whatever, but he's 6'7", 318, 3-year starter at left tackle for Wisconsin, 1 year at right guard. I know PFF had him as the 4th highest graded zone blocking run blocker in this year's draft class, behind guys like Mimbu and I can't remember the other 2 guys, but they all got drafted. Chase Lunt was one of them and somebody else. But, Nelson, that is, did not grade particularly well as a gap run blocker. So, fits the scheme in terms of outside zone that we know is going to be the thing that the Falcons major in. But one of the things that we will be talking about all summer long and have been talking about all off season long is hopefully Zach Robinson will kind of diversify the run game a little bit. And that will be one factor that's going to help this offense reach the heights that we need it to reach in 2025. My guess is, again, without really doing a deep dive in the Nelson film, is that he's probably more an option to replace Storm Norton as the swing tackle than he is to replace Caleb McGarry as sort of the starter at right tackle. But, we'll see with that development. We'll see what I think by the end of the film study. We won't finish Jack Nelson until, June or whatever. But, we talked about this a lot over the last month or so of the offseason, where whether or not will they or won't they when it comes to drafting an offensive tackle due to prioritizing re-signing their offensive line depth at the outset of free agency. I've been saying since the Senior Bowl, I would like to see them draft an offensive tackle. I've been saying for 3 years that I would like to see them draft a developmental offensive tackle, which goes back to some of the commentaries I've made in the past about why I didn't love their decisions to trade up, because they missed opportunities to draft offensive tackles over the last 3 years. But we don't quite know what the future is of Caleb McGarry beyond this season at right tackle. And, it became a position over the course of this offseason, given their other pressing needs, something that was probably going to need to be put on the back burner, but then, and kind of punt it till next year. And then the Falcons decided to trade their future first round pick, which was going to be their best asset to potentially replace and or upgrade that right tackle spot over McGarry in 2026. So it became a more pressing issue to have to at least get somebody in the door other than, Storm Norton, who the Falcons, I think, did the smart thing and showed some forethought by re-signing Storm Norton to a 2-year deal to at least give them another body on the roster, so that at least after the season, when they make the decision about Caleb McGarry, at least in theory, they will have 3 tackles on the roster, assuming Jack Nelson makes a team, with him, Storm Norton, and Jake Matthews on the team. So that gives them at least some insurance. So we'll see how that goes. I always enjoy diving into the offensive line film, and the rest of you sickos can dive in it with me as well as the other film of the other 4 draft picks by becoming Locked On Falcons insiders over the next 4 to 6 weeks, however long it takes. Usually it takes a little longer than ideally I could crank out one of these videos every week, and so we'll be done by the first week of June or whatever, but or Memorial Day, whenever that is. But we'll see on that front. But I like to produce videos on these draft picks before, and usually those come out a week before we do the full breakdown on the podcast. So that's a great incentive to become a Locked On Falcons insider, as well as you can see what I've already broken down with Jalon Walker and James Pearce already this offseason. So additional film breakdown, as well as get my ongoing thoughts as I go through the film. I will be letting the insiders know sort of my thoughts throughout the process, right? Rather than if you're just a podcast listener, you'll just get it at the final result at the end. So great way to become a Locked On Falcons insider. You'll get my musings on all things all summer long. After we get through the draft class, we'll be talking about all the things Zach Robinson is going to do, some of the things that Jeff Ulbrich is going to do, and get some film breakdowns of that as well all summer long. So great reasons to become a Locked On Falcons insider. You can join now and get a 14-day free trial. So in theory, if you join now, you'll probably get a Jalon Walker and James Pearce breakdown before you have to sign up. And after that, it's only $4.99 a month thereafter. So great reasons to become a Locked On Falcons insider. Hit that link in the description below at joinsubtext.com/LockedOnFalcons. For my international listeners, if you want to get access to it, just give me an email at lockedonfalcons@mail.com and we'll work something out. So let's move on from that and wrap up with some of the interesting comments that came from Falcons defensive coordinator Jeff Ulbrich about his plans for the defense, as well as these rookies, as we wrap up today's Locked On Falcons. So the NBA playoffs are here, and FanDuel is going to give new customers an incredible way to get in on that playoff action, because right now, when you join FanDuel, you'll place a $5 bet, your first $5 bet. You'll get $250 in bonus bets if that bet wins. And we love how FanDuel makes it easy to bet on so many different things, whether it's picking your favorite team. And I know for many of you, your favorite team is the Atlanta Hawks. And yes, I know it's too soon that they did not make it to the playoffs. David Mitchell. But, FanDuel is going to give you ways to find solace by putting a little cash in your pocket, making you feel good by winning a little bit of money, whether you want to bet on teams to win, you want to bet on player props, three-pointer steals, assists, whatever. You want to combine those props in the same game parlay, bet a little, win a lot for your chance to win big. So don't miss out by heading over to FanDuel.com and claim your $250 in bonus bets today. So, I thought Jeff Ulbrich had some interesting comments in the presser he did on Saturday morning during the draft, talking about sort of the pick so far and sort of what his plans are. One of the things that came out of that meeting was he talked about how he has had more input on the draft plans than he had in previous stints, whether that was him as a defensive coordinator at the Jets or position coach in Atlanta. And I thought that's noteworthy just because in the past, when we've talked about, how much do we praise or blame Terry Fontenot, I've always sort of not heaped as much criticism on Terry Fontenot as others have. And I know that sounds crazy to some of you guys because all you've heard, if you've been only listening to the podcast for the last month, is criticism of Terry Fontenot. But I promise you, it's only really been since the start of free agency that I've been going hard on the Terry Fontenot criticism. And I know people are like, you got to let Terry cook. And I just know every time someone says let Terry cook, that does not age well. So that I would just pump the brakes on talking about Terry cooking. But it's funny because with Terry Fontenot, we've talked a lot about he doesn't necessarily make as many decisions as I think people assume a general manager does, where it's every roster move is coming from the brain of Terry Fontenot. And I think it was just noteworthy to me that Jeff Ulbrich saying that he's had more input, because the reason I push back on that whole sort of Terry being, the puppet master or whatever, is because so many of the Falcons roster moves over the last 5 years have been sort of coach driven moves, right? And in finding players that the coaching staff had previous relationships. And I thought that was notable that Jeff Ulbrich basically said, yeah, I've never had this much input into the thing. It's kind of confirming what I was talking about. But then Raheem Morris in their post draft presser sort of kind of provided a little bit more clarity, where he kind of indicated that he was the one that kind of took the lead on letting Jeff Ulbrich and Zach Robinson sort of allow their input into, who they were targeting in the draft and whatnot. So just another sort of wrinkle in that whole conversation of just, how much is Terry cooking? Is he the head chef, or is he, the sous chef and all these other people are doing a lot of the stuff and he's just kind of deciding the menu and not really cooking up the thing. So again, that's bait and discussion for a later day. But the other more notable thing that we'll talk about is sort of what are his schematic plans for, Jalon Walker and James Pearce, right? And he talked about some of the things that they're going to plan to do to try to get, he was asked about their ability to impact early and how do you plan to do that? And he was like, we're going to do some things schematically that we think are going to be able to lighten their loads and allow them to, impact more quickly than you would typically expect. He talked about his past experience with guys like Jermaine Johnson and Will McDonald and how quickly they would impact, particularly in their second years in the NFL. Again, we want to fast track of that a little bit more in year one than year two. But, and he also made an interesting comparison to me, comparing Jalon Walker to Bryce Huff, who we talked about Bryce Huff, if you guys can recall going back to the week 2 matchup against the Eagles and talking about sort of a lot of the changes that the Eagles had to make with their, when the Falcons were basically able to run the ball down their throat. And then basically they had to adjust their run defense a little bit. And part of that was sort of scrapping Bryce Huff. They had these plans with Bryce Huff as a DPR. But I thought it was interesting, Jeff Ulbrich comparing Jalon Walker to Bryce Huff. And it's understandable because they have a similar size. Jalon Walker is a little longer than Bryce Huff is, but Bryce Huff is kind of limited because he's only a DPR because of some of the size limitations. And I don't think hopefully that's not the issue with Jalon Walker. I don't think that should be an issue with Jalon Walker. But speaking of Jalon Walker, he talked about how the plans are, we want to, simplify things for him, focus on him being an edge rusher, being an early down edge rusher, and then in certain situations, maybe kick him inside. And if you checked out the episode that Jarvis and I did immediately following the draft pick and our reaction to it, we kind of discussed some of the schematic things that the Falcons may be planning to do. So you could go back and listen to that episode to hear sort of the sport sort of specifics that we were kind of getting into, but it seemed like Jeff Ulbrich was kind of confirming what I kind of was getting at in that episode, where he'll be an edge rusher for the base defense, as well as most of the sub packages, but certain obvious situations, you'll start to see Jalon Walker get more of that stand-up role where they'll use him a lot more in obvious passing situations, like a K Nellis, where he'll potentially line up in that A gap as a stand-up rusher, and that will allow them to get James Pearce on the field as an edge rusher in those situations, get Pearce outside, because the expectation for James Pearce is going to be that he's going to be a designated pass rusher, situational pass rusher, whatever you want to call it, DPR, that we'll often say on this podcast. And it's interesting because some folks in the Locked On Falcons Discord, link in the description below, we were talking about this afternoon, and sort of what our thoughts were in debating this in terms of how they're going to divvy up the snaps at edge, because they have a lot of bodies, and the old saying is you can never have too many edge rushers, but that saying goes to a certain point, because if you have the same kind of edge rusher, you can have too many. You want to have guys that have complementary skill sets, and I don't think that's quite the issue with the Falcons, but they're kind of pushing that with a lot of these guys that are more probably geared to be DPRs than necessarily every down players. And so it'll be interesting to see how the Falcons adjust that rotation. But, I don't think they'll have any problems getting Walker on the field in early downs, because I do think Walker, even though he's not the biggest guy in the world, it certainly plays with a physicality enough that setting, you go to Georgia and you can't set the edge. They're gonna put you in the transfer portal at that point in time. Like, if you can't play the run at Georgia, it's going to be a problem. But so that's not going to be an issue with Jalon Walker. But some of the other guys like Floyd and AK and Pearce and all those guys may have a little issues with that. And so the reason why we bring that up is because you go back to last year, at the beginning of last year, the first 5 or so games of the season, we were sitting here being like, why aren't they getting Arnold Bichetti on the field? Because they were playing a lot of James Smith-Williams and Lorenzo Carter, because a lot of that was because they didn't really trust the other guys to play the run, right? And that's a big reason why D'Angelo Malone hasn't quite lived up to the hype, because he hasn't been able to get the snaps on the field to develop in order to develop as a pass rusher, because they have to hide him as a run defender. And so that's the main that's going to be the main concern with James Pearce is he going to be limited because of some of his issues against the run? So we'll see how that goes. But, the other, circling back to some of the schematic things that Ulbrich is talking about, and again, we didn't get specifics from him and won't get specifics from him. So we'll have to wait and see how that goes when the season starts. But it'll be interesting to sort of see, because it's something that you've heard me talk about a little bit, because the Falcons don't really have a pass rush unit that is built to win, where they can just line up 4 guys on the field. And again, there's no Aaron Donald on this team. There's no Jared Verse on the team, although we're hoping, right? We're hoping. Looking at you, Jalon Walker, looking at you. So, but there's nobody on this defense that you can say, oh yeah, that guy can win against not anybody, but most offensive tackles. And so we've talked about how the Falcons are going to have to scheme up pressure, right? That when we talked about Leonard Floyd's 2024 production with the 49ers, a lot of it was scheme and cleanup sacks. We talked a lot last year about, the best usage of Arnold Bichetti last year was when he and Grady Jarrett were lined up on the same side and they were running twists and stunts to those guys. And so are they going to do that with Morgan Fox or, one of these other guys like Ruka Roro and whatnot in order to maximize Arnold Bichetti this year? James Pearce's play style is a lot like Leonard Floyd's play style, where Tennessee often like to use him on stunts and twists in order to free him up. And that was a big part of why he was so productive in the SEC. And then, of course, you have guys like Jalon Walker and K Nellis, who are guys that you can move around the formation, stand up, and have them rush from different areas and whatnot. And so, it's basically the idea of the Falcons are just going to have to throw junk at teams in order to confuse offenses, because they just can't line up and win with 4. And so that was one of the reasons why we thought they should prioritize the back end and get better at the cornerback position, because they're going to need to play more press man coverage in order to maximize that, because the bend but don't break, the off zone stuff that the Falcons majored in so much last year just doesn't really work with that style of defense, in my humble opinion. I know other people think differently, but and that puts more pressure on guys like Bowman and Watts now, alongside Mike Hughes and whoever else is in the secondary. We know AJ's going to be fine. We know Jesse Bates out here cheating. He's going to be just fine. It was funny watching Billy Bowman. It was a play where he started cheating. I was like, I watched the game where he cheated. He cheated hard. I was like, okay, All right. I see what you did there, Billy. So, that would be fun to get into. So we'll see how it all comes together for this Falcons defense. Again, as I told Jarvis at some point last week or whatever, when Jarvis was talking about, hey, we're trying to get the average defense. And I'm like, Jarvis, we're just trying to get in the low 20s. Right? If we can get the 22 on defense, that, Jeff Ulbrich performed a miracle. So I thought it was interesting that he basically confirm some of my suspicions on how they're going to play. So we'll see how they execute that as the season wears on, and we'll speculate further about some of the different things they can do. And of course, we'll try to find some film to display some of that stuff over the course of the summer. So become a Locked On Falcons Insider at the link in the description below. So guys, that's going to do it. We'll be back tomorrow to talk more about, sort of the future of the Falcons and how this draft class can incorporate into this 2025 season a little bit more. We'll probably, we'll see. And then we'll hopefully have some guests on throughout the week to give their thoughts and share their opinions about the Falcons trade up and the talent that they got and all that stuff. So that is all in store for you here on Locked On Falcons. Make sure you subscribe or follow for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. Check out Locked On NFL Draft to get review of all the teams' drafts, as well as all the great shows across the Locked On Podcast Network that will be breaking down every pick, and whatnot, college shows as well, breaking down most picks, and whatnot. So it's all part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.